Good morning and welcome to Crossroads United Methodist Church online this Sunday. A few announcements before we begin. We have a few really cool events coming up that we wanted to make sure that you are aware of, two in particular. The first is our Youth Overnighter coming up on August 3rd. If you or your family would like to be a part of some games and activities the night before the Hall of Fame Parade right out here on Cleveland Avenue, let us know. Call the church office, 330-455-0153 during normal office hours, or get on our website and send us a message or on Facebook so that we can link you up to get here. We have a good time. We have a Nerf gun war. We watch movies, and then best of all, get some Johnny's Donuts and watch the Hall of Fame Parade on the Friday before the Pro Football Hall of Fame Parade. August 12th is the next event I want to make sure that you know about, and that is our Shore Neighborhood Block Party. This is the second annual block party that we have hosted in the greater Shore area. This year, our theme is I Live Here, where we are looking at lifting up what is probably one of the most diverse neighborhoods in our entire city. And they're going to be representatives from our greater Shore neighborhood cooking the food from their cultural heritage. I think we have 7 or 8 different countries and ethnicities lined up for some really delicious food. Bounce houses, water bounce houses, games for kids, music and cultural dancing, and a lot of fun to be had at King Park on August 12th for our Shore Neighborhood Block Party. And now, friends, as we engage worship this morning, we start looking at that question, who is my neighbor? I'll give you a little bit more insight on why I'm wearing this and this behind me. But right now, I invite you to prepare your hearts and minds for worship. Before we get into our scripture text, I'm going to do a little bit of explaining for myself on why I'm standing on what is the third floor of our church in a room that has no air conditioning and heat with a red sweater and everything back behind me. This is stuff my family has made me. About 5 years ago, I did a worship series entitled The Gospel According to Mr. Rogers. And so you see the stoplight my kids and my wife had made me just for Christmas this last year. Our associate pastor, Mike Farmer, got me this icon of Fred Rogers because he knows I love him so much. The fish tank, and of course, Daniel Tiger's clock. And our worship series here online and in person over the next few weeks, we're calling If the World Had a Front Porch. And one of the main things that we're trying to do with that worship series is just to get to know our neighbors just a little bit better. But I want to spend this first week delving into this text on maybe why that is such an important thing to do. So our first text as we get into this series is from Luke chapter 10, picking up in verse 25, and it reads, "Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he said, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' He said to him, 'What is written in the law? What do you read there?' He answered, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And he said to them, 'You've given the right answer. Do this, and you'll live.' But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?' Jesus replied, 'A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite. He came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But the Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them, and then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I'll repay you whatever else that you've spent.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." One day, Brendan, a young but rising DJ in New York City, was coming home to his Brooklyn apartment when a homeless woman asked him for some money. He said honestly that he had no money, but by the end of the week, she asked 2 more times as he was trying to go into his building. And each day he answered no. Finally, she frankly replied, "You better not, because every day you say you don't have any." Inserting some rational thinking into an otherwise awkward conversation, he proposed, "Look, I'm on my way to a job interview. If I get the job, I will take you out for Chinese food." This promise eventually yielded a friendship that neither of them were prepared for. That changed the trajectory of their lives, both forwards and towards each other. Brendan got the job that day, but their friendship didn't just end with Chinese food. They built a friendship of mutual support, spending their birthdays, their holidays, tough times to each other over a period of 8 years. When Brendan's heater broke, she made him a blanket. 2 days later, when he told her that he had lost his job, she disappeared, returning minutes later, bringing him groceries, and which she continued to do throughout the winter. Even with so little, she never hesitated to give back. Over these years, Jackie moved from the streets to subway stations and to a halfway house, and then eventually into the YWCA, and is now moving into an apartment. To celebrate this occasion, Brendan wanted to do something special for Jackie, and so he went to her, took her to Target and helped her pick out everything that she needed for her apartment, even started a registry for her. Then he set up a campaign to raise money to help pay for the things on her registry, it's now closed, along with an awesome video telling their story. While the original goal was to raise $500, the campaign went viral and they raised more than $6,000. And now they're looking to use the extra funding to support other women who might need help moving into their apartments. "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus asks. An Ohio town has eagerly ushered in the holiday season this year after answering the call for Christmas decorations to help a toddler with a terminal illness celebrate Christmas just one last time. Brody Allen was 2 years old, and he was diagnosed with an aggressive brain cancer in May and stopped treatments in August. When Brody's chemo treatment ended, we made a promise to each other that we were going to make it each and every single day as special as we could, says his sister to CBS News. And we wanted to do everything we could to give him as much joy and happiness as we could, even though he only had a short time left to live in this life. And Brody's illness began with a fall, and later scans led to a diagnosis of a tumor that rose in his brain. His family, the youngest of 6 siblings, loved seeing Christmas lights on their street. Alan said that while Brody can't walk anymore and that he's lost the use of his left arm, his neighbors decided to do something to raise his spirits. Our neighbors, even though it was not Christmas time, they write, put up their Christmas decorations right next door to us, and it just kept growing all the way down the street. And Brody absolutely loves it. His speech was impaired, and he's having trouble talking now, but he has the cutest little froggy voice when he goes out and sings Christmas carols in July down his neighbor's street. And who is my neighbor? Jesus asks. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave to me what is probably the best message on this very familiar story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. He said, of the 2 pastors who didn't stop by to help the man on the other side of the road, and it had always been a question of mine, well, why didn't they stop? It's so obvious for us to read the story now because we know how it ends and we know Jesus answers. We know the right answer. It's just common sense, isn't it? Jesus is telling us. We all know it. But Martin Luther King says that those 2 pastors traveling by that man who was beaten on the side of the road said that they were probably scared to stop. After all, the Jericho Road was a dangerous one with many twists and turns, dark alleys where places or people could hide to rob a man. And after all, that is what just happened. So Dr. King tells a story where both the pastors that walked by, he says, it's impossible that the priest and the Levite looked over that man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or is it possible that they felt that the man on the ground was merely faking and that he was acting like he had been robbed in order to hurt, in order to seize them and lure them into a false sense of security? But it's still so obvious, isn't it? In the story, the answer in Jesus' story, he gives the text, question 1, what's the most important commandment? Lawyer answers correctly, love God, love your neighbor. Yep, question 2. Here's an example. Now you pick the one who does the right thing. It's almost like the Goofus and Gallant cartoons. If you ever got the Highlights magazines when you were kids or you ever watched them when you were kids, the answer is so obvious. It's the one that showed him mercy. And who is my neighbor was the question the lawyers asked. You know how you remember certain things from your past that kind of, they bug you. There's one of these things that bugs me. When I was in college, I had gone camping with some friends to Put-in-Bay, Ohio. I remember and for whatever reason, we had the campground to ourselves. There wasn't anybody else camped out there, so it was just ourselves and my buddy. And I remember one night I'd put the fire out and it started to turn in for the night. And we saw a man, shadowy figure, walking near us. And when he got closer to us, it became more obvious that the man didn't have a tent and he was homeless and just didn't have anywhere to live. The man sat down at the picnic table at our campsite and we said hello, awkwardly. We noticed he talked to himself a lot. He seemed to be a bit out of his mind, drunk maybe, who knows, I don't know. I wasn't going to spend the time to ask. So he opened up the sleeping bag he was carrying near our tent. And you know what? My stomach tightened up, as Dr. King said happened to those 2 pastors. And I found myself afraid. Who knows what this man could do, I asked, or why he wants to sleep next to us. There's plenty of space here, after all. There's lots of campground space. So we called the ranger station. They came out and an officer escorted him elsewhere. When they did this, the other ranger came to me and said, "That's Fred. He's a disabled veteran. He sleeps here a lot, but it seems that he hasn't eaten for a while, so we're going to take him and get him some food. You boys have a good night." But I could see the disappointment in the ranger's face. My stomach tightened again. I never even asked. And who is my neighbor? In an attempt to redeem myself later in life, my wife and I had lived in Columbus and we were headed to church on a particular Sunday, and where we left our neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, there was a man sleeping outside of the bus station who looked like he was in dire straits. So we pulled the car over to stop to check on the man to make sure he was okay. He said he was hungry. We put him in the car. We got him down. We all had breakfast together. But it was cold and winter, and I felt some kind of way about putting him back outside. And I said, we're going to church after all. I don't know if you're Christian or anything like that, but at least the building will be warm. You can at least take a nap during the pastor's sermon. So I brought him in to church, and you would have thought I cleared out 3 different pews. And it was one of the ministers in this church who came up to me so irate that I would bring this person into that congregation. Friends, it may be an easy test, an easy cartoon, like Goofus and Gallant, but the truth is we fail every time, or at least as the story tells us, 2 out of 3 times, 2/3 of the time, we probably don't get it right. And so the first question the priest asked, the first question that the Levite was asked, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question in his mind. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Reverend John Edgar of Church for All People describes it this way. It's the move from Philadelphia, a brotherly love, of loving the people that are right around us, our immediate folks, to Philoxenia, love of the outsider. Someone I have no connection with whatsoever. It was after Martin Luther King Day. We had still lived in Columbus, and I was picking my son up from preschool, and he must have had a lesson in preschool or something. I remember because he asked me who Martin Luther King Jr. was, and I had tried to describe this to him, that he was this man who believed that people should live together in peace and harmony regardless of the color of their skin, and that folks should live with equity and justice, and that God created this world good and shalom, and we should live towards that. And this racism that existed back then with blacks and whites sitting on different sides, it just didn't exist. And he goes, yeah, that's good. You could tell there was this acknowledgement of the then 3-year-old James that, oh, this was a good man. And he asked me, well, what happened to him? Where's he at now? And to a 3-year-old, I kind of struggled to say, I had to swallow a bit and say, well, someone killed him, because not everybody thought that same thing. And at that time, we had pulled up next to St. Mike's Catholic Church, right there on High Street, south of Worthington and Clintonville, and there was a crucifix out there, and my 3-year-old son looks and says, kind of like him. I say, yeah, bud, kind of like him. The year was 1969, and there were race riots consuming the streets of Detroit. Because of the color of your skin, you were not allowed to swim in the same pool as white folk, as if to say that the color of your skin somehow, in some way, said something about your worth as a person. Police officers in the South were brutalizing African-American protesters, fighting to have their civil rights match that in which God had already bestowed upon them as a result of being His beloved children. Black people were not allowed in the same swimming pools. Enter all of this stuff. You might know the story, Francois Clemens. He said, Fred Rogers came to me and said, I have this idea. You could be a police officer, recalls Clemens. Clemens says that when he was first approached by Fred Rogers, he didn't like the idea much at first. He said, I grew up in the ghetto. I didn't have a positive opinion of police officers. Policemen were sicking police dogs and water hoses on people that looked like me, he said. And I really had a hard time putting myself in a police officer's role. So I was not excited about being a police officer at all. Still, Clemens came around to the idea and eventually agreed to take on the role on the Fred Rogers Show. And in the decades he spent as a part of the show, there's one scene in particular where Clemens remembers with great emotion. It was from an episode that aired in 1969 in which Rogers had been resting his feet in a plastic pool on a hot day. He invited me to come over and rest my feet in the water with him. Clemens recalls the icon Fred Rogers was not only showing my brown skin in the tub with his white skin as two friends, but that I was getting out of the tub and he was helping me dry my feet. Clemens says the scene, which he too also revisited in their last episode together in 1993, touched him in a way that he hadn't expected. He said, "I think he was making a very strong statement. That is to say, I still was not convinced that Officer Clemens could have a positive influence in the neighborhood and in the real world neighborhood. But I think I was proven wrong," Clemens would say. During Clemens' time on the show, he wasn't simply the friendly neighborhood police officer off the set. He was also a Grammy-winning singer who performed over 70 musical and opera roles and founded the Harlem Spiritual Ensemble. Fred Rogers, for his part, wasn't simply Clemens' iconic co-star. He was also his friend for life. He says he'll never forget the day Rogers wrapped up the program, as he always did, by hanging up his sweater saying, "You make every day a special day just by you being you. And I like you just the way that you are." This time in particular, Rogers had been looking right at Clemens. And after they wrapped up, they walked over and Clemens asked him, "Fred, were you talking to me?" "Yes, but I've been talking to you for years," Rogers said. "But you hurt me today." Friends, in life, we're going to feel a lot of things. But love is more important than our feelings. As the parable of the Good Samaritan shows us, love is action, not just for those in our immediate vicinity. And as we'll talk in future weeks, what it means to be part of Crossroads United Methodist Church means to be a neighbor to our Canton community, whether you know folks or not. Whether turning down certain streets kind of gives you a certain pinch in your stomach. It does mean getting off and listening to the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of people who are longing for a better life. Love is action. Choosing love is a choice. We must choose to love God, and we must choose to love our neighbor despite what we may feel in here and in here. Not just in word, but in how we live and how we act and how we serve one another. Fred Rogers, I think, said it right when he said, "There are many ways to say I love you. There are many ways to say I care about you. Many ways, many ways, many ways to say I love you." One of my favorite songs to sing to my children at bedtime, and I hope that they find ways to say I love you in many different kinds of ways, with not just me and his family, but learn to love those and choose love every day in life. Friends, go and do likewise. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, go in love and peace, and have a great week.